In terms of the cosmic bit, first of all, there's an idea in one of the books I'll refer to later, Conspirituality, that in both spiritual spaces and conspiracy theorising, there are three core ideas. And it's not to say that any of these ideas are necessarily completely wrong either, but those three core ideas that fit together in those two spaces are that everything's connected, that nothing happens by accident, and that things are not as they seem. And basically, something around those three ideas is what I mean by the cosmic part of that. And then when we talk about the right, we're talking about a political idea. And it's a very difficult thing to encompass very quickly. But ideas on the political right, it's a very broad spectrum, the same as on the left. You'll have people on the centre right. Their interests might be in things like freedom, individual rights, that sort of thing. And that can go to a point where that can be very normal and good. Those are both things that we can be very supportive of. But they might go into an extreme where it's about the freedom of one individual and the freedoms of other people aren't taken into account. Or ideas on the right can be about tradition, hierarchies of social groups, and again, there can be some bits of that that are more innocuous, and that can go to an extreme of the types of things we all know about in history from far-right organisations or fascist movements, where those hierarchies are very strongly imposed, and certain social groups might even be excluded from geographic areas or exterminated. Hopefully that's a rough approximate of what I'm kind of talking about with putting those two words together. So what is Community Solidarity Stoud District? We're a group that's formed to build community-led solidarity in the Stoud District to oppose the hatred of minorities and oppressed people arising from false and harmful information. Just very quickly again, define some words. By community, we mean groups of people who get together based on some shared characteristic. That could just be that they live near each other, or it could be an identity that they share. And by solidarity, we basically mean having each other's backs. There's two pictures there that you can see. One is a big gathering that we had with about 200 people when Katie Hopkins came to speak in the town with our big banner about the light paper. And then the one underneath is that not all our work is about the light paper or about the cosmic right and the events that they organise locally. We're also involved in the Stoud Ceasefire Now coalition. We've found a member of that. We've been doing lots of work calling for a ceasefire with the recent conflict in Gaza. And who am I? So I didn't say very much in my initial introduction, so I'm just a person. There's a little picture of me as a kid there. I was a little baby kid, just like all of us were. Now I'm a dad. I have a son who's roughly that age. I was brought up in the kind of alternative scene to some degree. You can see my rainbow knitted jumper, and I'm on the back of my dad's push bike. And I've been involved in all sorts of campaigning through the years. Anti-cuts, fracking, sitting in trees to stop them being cut down, anti-war. That's a picture of a protest outside the American airbase at Fairford that was happening in the run-up to the Iraq War, where about 5,000 people went there, and I'm one of the people carrying that fake stealth bomber at the front. And then the other pictures that you can see, if you can see the screen, are I went to the High Court one time with a court case to try and keep local NHS services in the NHS locally in our area. And one at the bottom is me getting arrested for doing some related, but later on NHS campaigning. That's Jeremy Hunt in the flash car, which I was putting flour on, and me getting arrested afterwards. But all of that is just to give you a little rough idea. Obviously, I can't tell you everything about who I am, but that I'm not some kind of government agent who believes everything that the media or the government tell them. And what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to talk about why our group exists, and Emma's already done a version of that. I'm going to talk about what we've been doing in Stoud, and I'm going to give you 3 key learning points of what we found having done that work. And before I start, just a little brief content warning, particularly in the context of what Emma said about not using hate speech in this place. I'm going to have to, as is the nature of the talk and explaining why we do what we do, highlight some content from the light, including some examples of racism. I'm going to show one anti-LGBTQ cartoon, and I'm going to show an advert that wasn't to do with the light paper, but has been shared by a group that is an offshoot of the one that hands out the paper in our town, which was used to advertise some Nazi meetings that were going to happen in our town, that have now been cancelled. But that advert features pictures of Hitler and some anti-Semitic content. And I'll give you another warning, hopefully, before I get to that. So why do we exist? The first thing to start with here is just that whether we're talking about the Light paper or the broader movement that it's part of, has a significant audience since 2020. And even if there was nothing wrong with that movement at all, I, as someone in the alternative scene, would be interested in that movement and trying to identify why it had grown so big, what was it like, and that sort of thing. In Stoud, just to give an example, one of the people who hands out the paper wrote an article in it recently in which he claims that they hand out about 1,600 papers a month. Now, there are lots of things in the Light that I don't take for granted. I'm not sure whether to trust them, and this is one of them. But if we assume that it's somewhere in the order of that number, then that would be significant. And we know that there is an audience for it in the town. He also writes that he thinks that the presence is now part of local civic life, that it's been normalised and broadly accepted and has some kind of cultural embeddedness. And for us, given what I'm about to say, the content of that paper, we find that quite concerning. It's worth saying that Indra mentioned that there's lots of things that have happened in the last few years that have prompted some of the stuff in the Light. And some of that has lessened, we're not in lockdowns anymore, that sort of thing. So to an extent, we might think that some of the intensity of that movement has dipped down a bit, but we find that it's still managing to deepen it's hold on certain individuals and to an extent able to recruit new people and still expanding. So we'd be interested in it whatever it was doing, but the reason why we're concerned are that it's introducing people interested in alternative ideas to, at first, conservatism, and then secondly, and more concerningly, the far right. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, but just as a very quick rundown of some examples, you might not be able to read these on the screen. There's lots of adverts in the paper, lots of content about holistic health and well-being. Lots of people are interested in those things. No real issue with that. Darren Smith, the editor, has posted on Facebook when asked at an event in Brighton what his politics were, that he described himself as being a constitutionalist interested in preserving what our ancestors have built up because it's really good. Now, for me, that's kind of a pretty good definition of what you would say small c conservatism. And lots of people might not have any problem with that. There are lots of things we do want to conserve, the natural environment, for example. But it's not what many people who are interested in alternative ideas expect to find when they engage in alternative ideas. They're wanting to change the world and get to a better place that's different in the future. So I think it's a really important distinction. The paper doesn't just does things that fit with this. So they had an article promoting Liz Truss, recently Conservative Prime Minister, and talking about how her ideas about there being a left-wing powerful economic establishment were correct, which I just think is very bizarrely wrong. And then the editor wrote an editorial in one paper where he talks about, and Emma sort of alluded to this, that his ideal is true capitalism, the absolute freedom and responsibility to take your products, services and ideas to market. Now again, that's not really something you'd expect to find in an alternative paper. That's the kind of stuff that we've had in this country for 30 years being promoted by governments and the media. So it's a bit strange. The paragraph that he writes that in says that in his ideal world, if a company this means no government regulation, but somehow in the following sentence he writes, if a company pollutes or defrauds, the people responsible go to court and get tried and punished. But if there were no regulations, what would they be being tried and punished for doing? They wouldn't be breaking any laws. He goes on to say, if they treat their workers poorly, then the workers will move to a better company. A massive misunderstanding of how capitalism works and the power differential between people with the money to employ people and the rest of us who have to scrabble around doing whatever we can to get the means to survive. Lots of the content in the paper, or lots of the people who read it and are sympathetic to it, have very legitimate reasons to question what happened in the last few years around COVID and the responses to it, and in particular the differential impact on people of different backgrounds. Working class people hit much harder, some people forced to go to work, all these things. But the paper just doesn't engage in just those legitimate things, it goes well beyond them. It asks whether COVID was real. It doesn't just raise questions about the COVID vaccines, it suggests that the smallpox vaccine didn't even work at all. And it talks about how HIV and AIDS were also some kind of made-up thing that didn't happen. And that indeed, any virus, there's a headline, I don't know if you can read it on the screen, all claims about viruses as pathogens are false. the paper tries to deny that viruses cause disease, and goes really specific on this with another one with a headline, "There's no such thing as a sexually transmitted disease." Now, these kind of things that's not legitimate questions about how we manage problems when viruses are in our community. That's a different level. And for people who were affected by these things, whose loved ones died or who experienced ongoing debilitation as a result, it's quite offensive. Similarly, when we talk about climate denial, this is probably the second most common topic of conversation in the Light paper. Some of the content is just very blatantly misleading or lies. So, the front page in issue 34 said there was no climate crisis, carbon dioxide has zero effect on temperatures. A couple of charts, one of them points you to the source and encourages you to go to the source. If you go to the source, you find that the bit of the data that they've used to show that temperatures are flat is the area in this red box, and that they just cut off all the data before and after it to give the impression that the line is flat when it's going up. It's really blatant, and to people who are concerned about being misled, which the paper is generally telling them to be concerned about being misled by the mainstream media, it's hard to understand why they would mislead people who are reading their paper in such a blatant way. Here's the cartoon that I talked about earlier, just for context, if you can see this. It's right on the inside page of the paper, with all the information about who the editor is and all the rest of it. And then there's a cartoon next to this by a man called Bob Moran, who was sacked by the Telegraph. Not exactly, again, someone from the alternative scene. He's described as that best political cartoonist, and the cartoon is of a parent asking their child out of school, and the child then vomiting up a rainbow, which kind of gives you this impression that the child has been force-fed LGBT stuff. That's the kind of thing they're trying to get over. And just in case that isn't clear enough, on the following page, there's an article about this, which I'm just going to read out. It's not very nice, but I'm going to read it out. As the month of July descends into a rainbow-festooned festival of the globo-homo cult that shall no doubt see us all having to watch the unedifying spectacle of police officers twerking beside their rebranded multicolour clown cars in cities across the nation, the question must surely be asked, just how much longer can society stomach being force-fed this most degenerate form of diversity? So, as I say, the cartoon is very clear in what it's trying to get across, but if you didn't get it, they're saying that we're being force-fed degenerate diversity. Just to give you another example of the really nasty language that ends up in the paper, the picture here on the right, if you can see it, was from the issue, not current, but the last one. And the editor, again, is the author of this piece. And he talks about the range of things that are the things that show that the world's gone mad and that the World Economic Forum is in charge of everything at the moment. And these include some things that it's just bizarre for him to say that I think lots of people in this room wouldn't really consider huge examples of authoritarianism. The imposition of cycle lanes, which, I mean, that's not happening a lot anyway, but even if it was. But, that's something fairly innocuous. The thing that's not innocuous is, he writes, the mass economic immigration of alien cultures leading to mass rape of young children, which I'm not going to get into this much. Other people may talk about it more later. Just say that is a blatantly racist statement. And that's of a piece with lots of content in the paper which promotes the individuals, organisations and ideas of the far right. You've got an article here, an interview, very soft interview by the editor again with Katie Hopkins. Lots of people here might know her as a kind of controversial social media figure, but she has in recent years signed up with a far right online media organisation. She's attended conferences with Holocaust deniers and so on. We've written about that on our website, so you can read more about that. There's a kind of standard Daily Mail article headlined, "Taxpayers foot the bill for housing asylum seekers," which concludes by denying that anyone is actually seeking asylum from authoritarian regimes by saying that the rest of us are going to be priced out of our homes to make way for taxpayer-funded economic migrants in deals landlords will be unable to refuse. The article over here on the left is headlined "Far Right, That's Far Off the Mark." It's an attempt to deny that the far right label can ever be applied. But the article itself then is trying to make out that the riots that happened outside the Knowlesy Hotel that housed asylum seekers weren't stoked by Patriotic Alternative, which was at the time Britain's largest fascist organisation. They'd leafleted in the area beforehand. Members of their organisation were seen at the protests that turned into riots, and yet the article tries to make out that despite this being widely covered, there weren't any such links. Even despite that, the article managed to then also make some quite far-right talking point language. It talks about huge numbers arriving, the question of how they're being vetted and properly accounted for, and why most appear to be young men. And then it says that concerns about grooming gang scandals are real, and that people who are concerned about them will stop at nothing to protect their children and their communities. Now, this kind of language, for people who aren't familiar with this stuff, you can easily see how someone would read it and think, well, that seems entirely legitimate. People should be concerned about grooming gangs and sexual, and they should. But the reality is that both these things have been seized upon by far-right movements to talk about sexual assault as if it only happens in communities of people from other places or with non-white skin. The last of the things that I've highlighted on this screen is the headline For Britain, which is a far-right political party that's now folded. Are they far-right fascists or old-school conservatives? This article was a headline of an interview, a very soft, again, interview with Anne-Marie Waters, the founder of that movement, described by Nigel Farage of UKIP and Reform and all those things as a party of Nazis and racists. Comes to something when he says that. And what's interesting about this article is I would say that For Britain is a far-right, is a kind of was a fascist kind of party. But what's interesting is the paper, in denying that, doesn't try to present them as something beyond being old-school conservatives. And again, in a paper that's presenting itself as an alternative voice, that's quite a strange thing to promote them as. I mean, why would anyone be interested in old-school conservatives? Even if that's all they were. So the next one, I'm going to get into the worst stuff. So for those of you who can see the slides, this is where the nastiest bit. Now, this isn't from the Light paper, but my talk is about the cosmic right, not just the paper, but the organisations and events that are being organised around it. And locally, we've had a group that has, as I said, split off from those that hand out the paper, but used to be the one that the two halves of the split used to organise events together. So they organised events with James Dellingpole, for example, a climate denier who has also recently been involved with white nationalists and racists. But now they're split. So their group is called Project Libertas. This is an email that they sent out in which they said, Project Libertas has the greatest pleasure and is extremely excited to introduce author John Hamer for 2 back-to-back talks. Check out the flyers and come along to a mind-altering and mind-expanding evening and meet like-minded people. What were the 2 events? One was called Adolf Hitler, The Real Truth, The Man and the Myths, and the other was called The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, which is, for those of you who don't know, this is arguably the most dangerous conspiracy theory ever. It was a fraudulent document created most likely by the Russian secret police, uncovered to be a fraud in the early 1900s. Basically, a load of anti-Semitic stuff cobbled together and used to present itself as a supposed true minutes of a meeting of Jewish people. It was used by the Nazis. It was used to justify genocide. The other thing about these 2 meetings, the one about Adolf Hitler was slated to happen, as it says on the advert, on the 135th anniversary of Hitler's birth. It's very difficult to imagine how such an advert, which features 2 pictures of Hitler, one looking very statesman-like and one with his dog, trying to make him look very human, it's hard to understand that can't be interpreted as Nazi sympathising or just as straight-up Nazi meetings. Here it is a bit bigger, but it's too small and too faded really for any of you to probably have a look at it. But if any of you want to afterwards, I'm here for the whole rest of the day. The last reason to mention about why we do what we do is that ignoring it isn't working. That was the strategy that many of us took in Stoud for the first couple of years. We might have individually raised questions with the people handing out the paper or about the events, but we didn't organise anything collectively. That didn't work. Naomi Klein writes in her recent book that the confusion they sow and the oxygen they absorb increasingly stand in the way of pretty much anything helpful or healthful that humans might, at some point, decide to accomplish together. And that's why we're concerned about this stuff, that all the other things we're doing in our communities get undermined by this kind of movement and the denial of issues that it presents and the hate speech and racism that is being fostered. So what have we done so far? We launched our group in January 2022. We launched it to coincide with Holocaust Memorial Day that year because the paper had published an article defending a pensioner who was jailed for, he'd engaged in Holocaust denial, but what he was jailed for was for inciting racial hatred. And what he'd said was really horrible. It was genocidal, anti-Jewish stuff. He'd asked his listeners to send him a gun. He'd said that Jewish people, including young Jews, like myself in the photo you saw earlier, should be killed because they were like rats and that they should be killed regardless of whether they were babies or not. And he was defended in the paper on the grounds that this was freedom of speech and he was entitled to his opinion. There was no criticism made of any of his comments. So we made a leaflet about that and handed that out. What else do? We do our research, as the phrase goes. We read the Light. We read every edition of the Light. Sometimes we put things on our website where we offer a sort of summary for people who don't want to read it. But we also read other things. We read books about this phenomenon. I brought a couple of them with me. Conspirituality, the podcast of that name, but the authors have recently written a book. Naomi Klein's recent book, Doppelganger, and a number of books about anti-fascism, the most important of which I'd say is Post-Internet Far Right, which I'd really recommend to everyone. We use our freedom of speech. Emma talked about this a bit earlier. We don't try to ban the paper. We don't seek to get any authority to do anything about it. We just take the opportunity to go out into the streets ourselves, hand out our leaflets and talk to people. We've produced a range of leaflets covering different issues in the Light paper, from the climate denial, the links to the far right and promotion of the far right, the attitudes to women that you're going to talk about later, and the transphobia and homophobia that Jonah's going to talk about later. And we've recently produced a leaflet that kind of signposts to all of those different things. We've got a website where we collate all of that and some other articles that we don't turn into paper form, and we've got a Facebook page. And with all of it, we try to do basically two things: write detailed information where we look at things really in depth, and to write accessible information that anyone can engage with. One of the things we do is we've organised some open letters, and again, just to be really clear, these are not petitions aimed at any authority trying to get them to do something. They're ways for us to show the breadth of community opposition to what's going on. Because lots of the people involved in handing out the paper in Stoud were our friends at one point, or people that lots of us know, and we want them to look through a list of names and see, oh, well, what's going on here? All my friends are saying they don't like this. And we've done that a few times. We've done it about the paper being handed out, asking them not to. That's all we're doing, asking them. We did it about Katie Hopkins being invited. We did it about the recent Nazi meetings, and we also did it when James Delingpole got invited to the town. We use our freedom of assembly, so when it's appropriate, we protest about those things. We don't generally protest about them handing out the Light. We don't protest at every meeting that they hold, because not all the meetings are as concerning. But when Katie Hopkins was invited to speak, we held the rally with about 200 people in that photo I showed you right at the start. She got invited back again to speak at a pub after the initial venue dropped her. And when she came to the pub, that was in an area outside part of the town surrounds, but with a local village community called Whites Hill and Ruscombe. And so we thought it was best if they organised the protest. We just supported them. The photo on the bottom is about 100 people attending that outside the pub where she spoke. And we don't just focus on what people we don't like are doing. We do work with the people that we want to support as well. So we support marginalised people and work with other groups. We work with Stoud District together with refugees. There's some pictures there in the top right of the rally that they held. We work with Stoud Pride. They organised a candlelit vigil about Brianna Gay, and we attended that. And every year we organise the local Holocaust Memorial Day events, where we not only speak about the Jewish experience, but invite people to speak about the experience of other groups that were targeted by the Nazis. This year we had a very powerful speech by a woman speaking about the disabled people that were targeted by the Nazis. So I'm realising that I'm not leaving much time for questions, but there will be time to ask questions in the discussion sections. I'm just going to rattle through quickly 3 things we've learned during our time. The first of those I've already talked about a bit, but just to really ram it home, there is a pipeline. We see how people who previously shared ideas like ours have been moved over to very concerning things. So people who were Corbynites have moved over to enthusing about Donald Trump, who has quite a different politics, I think most people would agree. We've myself encountered someone the other week who I spoke to who was wearing a keffiyeh and a Palestinian badge. Absolutely no problem with those things. But when I spoke to her, it was striking to discover that she was happy to repeat Islamophobic talking points, which I think is very strange for someone who's trying to express solidarity with Palestine. We've seen Extinction Rebellion activists or other people who were involved in climate action embrace fully climate denial and start to spread it. And as I showed with the advert, all of this goes all the way up to people defending the Nazi meetings and endorsing the protocols of the Elders of Zion. The second point leads on for that, which is that we've found, and we've tried to talk to the people lots, we've tried lots of different methods of doing that. There's basically no limit to what will be excused, minimised and repurposed. And this concerns us because we don't think we've seen the most dodgy stuff yet. We think it's got further to go. We think that these people aren't currently Nazis, except maybe the ones who organised that meeting, but that they look quite a lot like what the Nazis did before they were the Nazis, when they were just interested in some strange occult ideas. We'll probably hear more about that in the article later. But the key problem is if they get this idea that there's nothing that's out of limits, that's a group of people who are set to be indoctrinated into some scary things, potentially. Examples of the things we hear when we've challenged people, oh, well, that's just one article. Well, then we've said, well, it's not just one article. Oh, well, there have been some editorial slip-ups along the way, but that's getting better. The paper's getting tighter as it goes on. Well, that doesn't seem to be true either. Even the Nazi meetings, so the group that hands out the light, which, as I said, was not directly involved in the meetings. So they wrote a letter in which they acknowledged that the, quote, iconography and feel of these promotional materials could easily and justifiably be construed as unalloyed Nazi apologism, a position which we find disturbing and unreservedly reject. So that's good. They could reject that. But at the end of their statement, they had to say that serious, sober historical discussion about Hitler and Nazism may be welcomed, even if it challenges prevailing viewpoints. They had to keep in there that it's okay to challenge the reality of the Holocaust. This is their standard line for anything where we say, well, this is unacceptable, this is wrong. They just say, well, it challenges prevailing viewpoints. It's not the mainstream, so it must be okay. And that's not the case. Some things that challenge the mainstream are wrong, are dangerous, and we shouldn't go along with them. The last thing that we've learned is that we can build and demonstrate broad community opposition, and we can win people over. We haven't won any of the most committed people over, but there are a lot of people who were neutral about the light being distributed in the town, or slightly sympathetic to it, who have at minimum come to understand where we're coming from, and to see that there is something wrong, and it is acceptable, legitimate for us to challenge that. And we've had big public meetings like this one today along the way. Thanks for listening. I think I'm at the end of my allotted time, so there won't be a huge amount of time for questions, but please do write them down and we'll get to them at some point during the day.